The afternoon sun bore down on the quiet suburban street as Naomi Carter stepped out of her black SUV, balancing a grocery bag in one hand and resting the other gently on her pregnant belly. At 7 months along, even short walks felt heavy, but she refused to let her condition slow her down. The smell of freshly cut grass mixed with the faint scent of summer rain still lingering from the morning. She had just returned from her prenatal checkup, feeling good and humming softly to herself. That peace shattered when she heard the sharp growl of a police cruiser pulling up behind her vehicle. A uniformed officer, broad-shouldered, pale-skinned, and wearing mirrored sunglasses, stepped out with an authority that was more aggression than professionalism. His badge read Officer R. Collins, and his expression was already fixed in a scowl. "Hey, step away from that car," he barked, his voice slicing through the air. Naomi paused, momentarily confused. "Excuse me? This is my car," she replied, calm but firm. Collins scoffed, scanning her up and down with a look that made her skin crawl. "Don't get smart with me. I've had reports of a stolen vehicle matching this description, and you fit the profile." Naomi blinked in disbelief. "Fit the profile? What profile is that?" Her voice held both disbelief and controlled anger, but Collins didn't answer, at least not directly. Instead, he stepped closer, towering over her. "Turn around. Hands where I can see 'em." She instinctively took a step back. "I'm pregnant," she reminded him, as if that fact might trigger a shred of humanity. But instead of backing off, Collins moved faster, shoving her shoulder with unnecessary force. The grocery bag tumbled to the ground, apples and bread scattering across the asphalt. Naomi stumbled, clutching her belly as pain shot through her side. "Don't resist," he barked, and before she could respond, his boot caught her leg in a swift, brutal kick that sent her crumpling to her knees. The shock and fear stole her breath. "Stop," she gasped, her voice trembling as she tried to protect her stomach. The world seemed to slow for a moment, her heartbeat pounding in her ears, her mind flashing to her unborn child's safety. A neighbor across the street gasped, pulling out a phone to record. Collins loomed over her, his shadow stretching across the pavement. "You people think you can get away with anything," he sneered, not realizing that every word, every action was being captured on camera. Naomi's hand shook as she reached for her purse. She knew she had to show him her identification before this escalated further. What Collins didn't know, what he was seconds away from discovering, was that Naomi Carter wasn't just some suspect he could push around. She was the wife of the chief of police, and her ID would make him wish he'd never stepped out of that cruiser. Serena sat in the sterile hospital room, her hands resting protectively over the swell of her belly, her mind replaying the events like a broken film reel she couldn't shut off. The sharp kick from Officer Harlan's boot had sent her sprawling to the ground in the middle of the sidewalk, the pain shooting up her side and radiating deep into her core. She had pleaded with him, her voice trembling but clear. "I'm pregnant." But instead of stopping, he had sneered, towering over her as if she were just another nuisance he could stomp out of his way. The humiliation burned just as much as the ache in her ribs. Now, hours later, the doctor had finally assured her the baby's heartbeat was strong, but that didn't erase the knot of rage and disbelief coiled tight inside her. She had dealt with discrimination before, more times than she could count, but never this blatant, this violent, and certainly not while carrying her child. Her phone lay on the bedside table, buzzing endlessly with messages. One from her husband read simply, "I'm on my way." Another came from her assistant. "The mayor's office is calling. Something's happening." She ignored them for the moment, her mind torn between the instinct to protect her child and the burning need to make sure Officer Harlan paid for what he had done. She could still see his smirk when she reached for her bag to show her ID. How he'd slapped it out of her hand before she could pull it free, the laminated card sliding across the pavement like a discarded piece of trash. He never even looked at it. That was his mistake. Serena knew that her position, the one that gave her influence over the very police department that employed him, wasn't something she flaunted. But tonight, she realized it was time to use it. This wasn't about ego or revenge. It was about justice, about sending a message that no badge granted a man the right to harm an innocent, let alone a pregnant woman. When the door opened and her husband, Marcus, stepped in wearing his dark tailored suit and that air of quiet authority that made even seasoned politicians sit straighter, Serena felt her resolve harden. He didn't rush to her side. He stopped, looked at her belly, then at her face, and his jaw clenched. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice low but edged with steel. And so she did, every shove, every insult, every ounce of contempt in Harlan's voice. By the time she finished, Marcus wasn't just angry, he was dangerous. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the sterile white corridor as ambulance staff wheeled Amara toward the emergency room. Her breathing was heavy, every inhale sharp with pain, but her eyes were fixed ahead, not on the gurney or the fluorescent lights, but on the image burned into her mind, the officer's cold, unrepentant face. Beside her, Nurse Elena's voice was calm but urgent, guiding the team as she monitored the baby's heartbeat. "Fetal distress," she murmured under her breath, not loud enough for Amara to hear, but enough to make the junior nurse's eyes widen. Amara gritted her teeth. She wasn't going to panic, not here, not now. She had handled corporate boardrooms filled with predatory billionaires. She could handle this. But beneath the steely resolve, fear twisted in her gut, not for herself, but for the tiny life inside her. As they rushed her into the room, hospital security arrived, not for her safety, but because the racist cop who kicked her had shown up. Officer Grant strutted in with the arrogance of a man convinced he had done nothing wrong. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming, his smirk untouched by guilt. "I need a statement from the suspect," he said to the charge nurse, as though Amara's position was that of a criminal and not a patient. The room froze for a heartbeat before Dr. Hayes, the attending physician, turned on him. "She's not your suspect. She's my patient. And unless you want a lawsuit that will bankrupt this hospital's police contract, you'll step back." Grant's smirk faltered, but not for long. "You don't know who you're talking to," he sneered. Amara propped herself up on her elbows, ignoring the pain. Her voice cut through the air like steel. "No, Officer Grant, you don't know who you're talking to." For the first time, she let her ID slip from her purse, the one that bore the insignia of the governor's office. The officer's eyes darted to it, confusion flickering before recognition set in. His face drained of color. The badge in front of him wasn't just any identification. It marked her as the wife of Governor Marcus Ellington, a man who had personally appointed the police commissioner and had authority over Grant's career. The charge nurse raised an eyebrow, clearly catching on to the shift in dynamic, while Dr. Hayes shot the officer a look that said, "Get out before you ruin your life more than you already have." But Grant, stubborn in his ignorance, muttered something under his breath about special treatment and tried to hold his ground. That's when two state security agents entered, their suits immaculate, their presence commanding. "Officer Grant," one of them said coldly, "you are to leave this facility immediately. The governor will be speaking with your department." The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the beeping monitors seemed to pause. Grant's jaw tightened, but he stepped back, each movement slower than the last, his eyes flickering between fear and humiliation. Amara lay back against the bed, her hand instinctively resting on her stomach as the baby's heartbeat steadied. She had been through worse in her career, but this was different. This was personal. And as she watched the disgraced officer leave, she knew this wasn't over. This was just the beginning of a reckoning he wouldn't see coming until it was far too late. The air in the small-town police station was thick with unease as Jasmine sat in a cold metal chair, her wrists still bound by the cheap biting handcuffs. She stared at the grimy floor, her stomach twisting with both pain and restrained fury. The racist cop who had kicked her, Officer Brad Keller, leaned casually against the wall across from her, arms folded, trying to mask the hint of nervousness that now crept into his posture. It wasn't because he felt remorse. No, Brad Keller was far too arrogant for that. It was because his partner, Officer Torres, had stepped outside moments ago after glancing at Jasmine's ID with a pale, almost panicked look. Jasmine knew that her identity was about to turn this station upside down, But she wasn't going to be the one to announce it. She preferred watching the cracks form in their confidence, one by one. Through the cracked glass window of the office, she could see Torres pacing while on the phone, his eyes darting toward her every few seconds. Brad muttered something under his breath about uppity women thinking they can do whatever they want, but his voice lacked the same venom from earlier. That bravado was slowly leaking away. Jasmine took a slow breath, keeping her face impassive, letting silence weigh on him. Suddenly, the sound of tires screeching outside broke the tension. The front door slammed open, and Chief Daniels stormed in, his face flushed with barely contained rage. "Keller, Torres, in my office. Now." His voice was like gravel grinding under heavy boots. Brad straightened immediately, the cocky smirk evaporating as he followed orders. Torres, still clutching the phone, whispered something to the chief before disappearing into the office. Moments later, the muffled but sharp sound of the chief's voice rang out. "Do you have any idea who she is?" The words hit Brad like a hammer. His voice came back faint, stammering excuses about suspicious behavior and standard procedure, but Daniels cut him off. "You kicked a pregnant woman. And not just any woman. She's the wife of Colonel Marcus Hale, the state Special Forces commander. Do you understand the magnitude of your stupidity?" Jasmine almost smiled at that, but kept her head down, letting the chaos unfold. When they emerged, Brad's face was pale as chalk, his hands trembling slightly. Torres avoided her gaze completely. Chief Daniels knelt beside Jasmine and unlocked the cuffs himself, his voice now soft and full of forced respect. "Mrs. Hale, I deeply apologize for what happened here tonight. This will be addressed immediately." Jasmine stood slowly, brushing the dust off her maternity dress, meeting his eyes with an icy stare. "Oh, it will be addressed," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel. Brad tried to mutter an apology, but Jasmine simply walked past him without a glance. In that moment, the chain of command had flipped. She was no longer the silent victim, but the one in control, and they knew it. What they didn't know was that this was just the beginning of their reckoning. The sterile white of the hospital corridor seemed to blur around Detective Marcus Hill as he sat in the waiting area, his knee bouncing with restless energy. His mind kept replaying the incident, her startled cry, the way she clutched her stomach, the flash of the ID badge that had made his gut twist. Every sound in the hallway made him flinch, expecting to hear someone announce bad news. On the other side of the double doors, doctors worked to stabilize Naomi, and each minute felt like an hour. His partner, Jenkins, stood in the corner, arms crossed, clearly frustrated but also nervous. Neither of them spoke. The silence was suffocating. Marcus kept trying to justify it in his mind. She was resisting. "I didn't know she was pregnant. I didn't know who she was." But deep down, he knew none of it excused his actions. His training had taught him better. His badge demanded better. Then the doors swung open, and a tall, imposing man in a tailored suit strode in, his presence immediately commanding the room. Chief Howard. The air shifted instantly. Conversations in the hallway hushed, and officers nearby straightened like school children caught misbehaving. Howard's eyes cold and sharp, locked onto Marcus like a predator sighting prey. "Office, now!" The words weren't shouted, but they carried enough weight to make Marcus's stomach churn. Inside the chief's office, the blinds were drawn, the atmosphere oppressive. Howard didn't sit. He didn't offer a seat. He simply stood, his fists resting on the desk, leaning forward as if daring Marcus to breathe wrong. "You assaulted a pregnant woman in public," Howard said, each word clipped. "That woman happens to be my wife. And now she's in surgery because of you." Marcus's throat went dry. He opened his mouth to speak, but Howard raised a hand. I don't want excuses. You were supposed to serve and protect. Instead, you humiliated this department and nearly cost my family everything." The weight of the words crashed over Marcus like a tidal wave. Howard's voice lowered, but it was more dangerous now, like a quiet storm before a hurricane. "You're done here, Hill. Badge gun now." The sound of the badge hitting the desk was deafening in the silence that followed. Marcus's hands trembled as he set down his sidearm. Howard didn't look at them. His gaze stayed fixed on Marcus, burning with a mixture of fury and contempt. "You'll be lucky if I don't press charges myself." As Marcus left the office, every step felt heavier. The hallway seemed longer, the stares from fellow officers sharper. This wasn't just the end of his career, it was the unraveling of the life he'd built, the final consequence of a moment's cruelty and arrogance. And somewhere beyond those double doors, Naomi was still fighting, and her husband was ready to make sure Marcus paid for every second of her pain. The police station was suffocatingly quiet, the kind of stillness that made even the hum of the fluorescent lights feel deafening. Every officer present could feel the tension thick in the air, as if a storm had gathered in the room but hadn't yet broken. Detective Harris sat in the interrogation room, his palms sweating as the realization of what he had done continued to gnaw at him. He had acted on prejudice, not facts, and now the fallout was spiraling faster than he could contain it. In front of him, Angela sat with her head held high, her eyes locked on him with a mixture of disappointment and quiet strength. Her swollen belly was a reminder not only of her vulnerability, but also of the life he had recklessly endangered. For the first time in his career, Harris couldn't rely on his badge or his uniform to shield him. Chief Daniels had entered the room minutes earlier, his face an unreadable mask, and now stood in the corner with his arms folded, watching Harris squirm. "Do you have any idea who you just assaulted?" Daniels' voice was low, but each word carried the weight of a gavel slamming down. Harris swallowed hard, his atoms apple-bobbing. "Sir, I didn't know. You thought?" Daniels cut him off sharply. "You thought she was a threat because she's black, pregnant, and standing on a sidewalk?" Harris had no answer. He dropped his gaze to the floor, unable to meet the chief's eyes. Angela's ID still sat on a metal table between them, its government insignia gleaming under the harsh lights. Her name and title were unmistakable: Dr. Angela Ward Daniels, senior advisor to the governor's office. And more importantly, Daniels' wife. Harris felt the color drain from his face. The reality hit him in waves. He had not only endangered the life of an innocent woman, but also committed an act that could cost him his badge, his pension, and whatever shred of dignity he had left. "You didn't just assault my wife," Daniels said coldly, stepping closer. "You assaulted the woman carrying my child. You humiliated her in public. And you've embarrassed this entire department." Harris tried to speak, but his voice cracked. "Sir, I'll apologize." Angela finally spoke, her voice calm yet razor-sharp. "An apology won't erase what you did. You didn't just kick me. You kicked the idea that people like me deserve safety, dignity, and respect." Her words pierced deeper than any disciplinary report could. The silence that followed was suffocating. Harris knew there was no path forward that didn't end in ruin. Daniels' next word sealed it. "Turn in your badge, Harris." Effective immediately. The clatter of metal on the table echoed like a final verdict. And as Harris was escorted out, Angela leaned back in her chair, her hand resting protectively on her belly, knowing this was only the beginning of holding him accountable. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. News of the incident had spread far beyond the city limits, turning this case into a national story. Every major news outlet had a camera trained on the proceedings, and the world was ready to see how justice would be served. Amelia sat beside Marcus at the plaintiff's table, her presence calm, yet commanding. She wore a navy blue suit that seemed to declare power without a single word. The moment the judge entered, the murmurs died down, and the trial began. The prosecution presented damning footage from the gas station security cameras showing Officer Daniels shoving and then kicking Amelia while she clutched her stomach. Gasps rippled through the audience as the video replayed, the brutality impossible to deny. Daniels, in his crisp uniform, sat at the defense table, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists under the table. His attorney argued that it was a misunderstanding in a tense situation, but the judge's expression remained unreadable. Then came the turning point. Amelia herself took the stand, Her testimony was precise, her voice unwavering. She spoke not just of the pain and fear she felt in that moment, but of the countless stories she'd heard from other victims of excessive force, stories that rarely saw the light of day. She locked eyes with Daniels as she recounted how he had looked directly at her ID and still treated her like she was less than human. "I'm not here because I'm the police chief's wife," she told the court, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "I'm here because no woman, no person should ever be treated like this, pregnant or not, black or not." Her words landed like a gavel strike in the hearts of everyone listening. The defense tried to poke holes in her account, but the video evidence and eyewitness testimonies left them grasping at straws. When the jury returned, the verdict was unanimous, guilty on all charges including assault, abuse of authority, and violation of civil rights. Daniel's face crumpled as the sentence was read. 5 years in prison, loss of pension, and permanent removal from law enforcement. The crowd erupted in applause, and Marcus squeezed Amelia's hand, his eyes glistening with pride. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, microphones thrust forward. Amelia stood tall, speaking with measured grace. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice amplified by every camera in the nation. "It's about accountability. It's about change. And it's about making sure the next person doesn't have to fight this battle." Her image, poised and resolute, would be replayed across the country for weeks to come, a symbol of strength, justice, and the unshakable truth that even the most protected uniforms are not above the law.